Hi, here we are. We are back in the middle of chapter 8. We had just finished reading the little time in her memories of meeting Russell, and I'll just redo that last paragraph. I had a happy time meeting the other two sisters, Annie and Ella, and the three brothers, Almus, Jim, and Ralph. It took several days to learn the names of the many nieces and nephews and who belonged to whom. Although in spirit I was back in the States, back in years, my physical self was still in the present and in prison. I was still crying and having no slip or handkerchief. I had to use the skirt of my dress to sop up my tears. It became soaked. As I stood up to shake it out, as I walked back and forth, hoping it would dry. It became soaked, so I stood up to shake it out, as I walked back and forth, hoping it would dry. Weary, I sank down onto the floor again, thinking how beautiful our courtship had been, with nothing to mar the memories of it. How lovely, Lord, it is to make memories without regrets. Help me always to remember this. May I never allow anything in my life that, like the touch of soiled fingers, would leave a stain of regret. That's a really important thing. I thought again of Russell's father and the others, and remembered their loving goodbyes when I was leaving to return to Boone. I knew I had found a place in their hearts and was considered family. Thinking of them, I remembered that they knew nothing of Russell's death. Hurting for them, the tears started again, and I was helpless to staunch them. Stretching onto the floor, I pressed my face into my wadded-up skirt, lest the night watchman hear my sobs. I continued to remember. And I'll be with you as soon as this convention is over, Russell called as the train began to move. I realized how blessed I was. We had agreed that our wedding should be simple. I could make my own dress, veil, and bouquet. Occupied with happy thoughts, I was soon back in Boone. It was a beautiful wedding. Our church friends asked if they might decorate. My pastor, Reverend J.H. Woodward, performed the ceremony. His wife, Flossie, an accomplished pianist, provided the music, and Nina Knudsen, a dear friend, agreed to be my bridesmaid, and her brother, Earl, was best man. The church was packed, and everyone in my family was there. More elegant weddings there have been, but none more beautiful. My friends and family helped to make it so, and the weather was kind that evening on August 18th, 1937. We drove back to Pennsylvania that very night. I enjoyed being with the Deibler family again. They had showers and dinners that I might meet more of Russell's family. We received many beautiful wedding gifts, which we took to our apartment in Dr. and Mrs. Schumann's home in Nyack-on-the-Hudson. Russell was away much of the time, and the Schumanns often remained in New York during board meetings. This left me to rattle around by myself in the large 3-storied house. When my schedule allowed, I rode with the Schumanns to New York City to meet Russell, returning from meetings. The officials were busy men, but always took time to visit with me. All were men with many, many years on the mission field or in the homeland. When special prayer requests were received, I saw men who believed in everything by prayer and supplication. Philippians 4:6. It was reassuring to a young missionary to know that behind me stood men and women of this caliber. Before the fall semester finished, Dr. Schumann informed us that the field had requested an immediate sailing for us. All missionaries to the Netherlands East Indies were to spend time in the Netherlands in language study. I was assured that my grades were sufficiently high for me to receive my credits. We went home to pack and say goodbye to our families. We were booked to sail from New York on January 27, 1938. The ship's band was playing Harbor Lights as the anchor was hoisted. The lines were cast off, and the tugs nudged the vessel away from the dock. Our friends from headquarters who had come to say farewell to us were soon swallowed by the fog. Watching the harbor and the New York skyline recede in the distance, I pondered future harbors and tomorrow's seas. My ignorance of the future held no cause for anxiety, for my spirit witnessed within me that God was and would be in control. With exhilarating joy, I turned my face into the wind blowing off the Atlantic. Notwithstanding the rough seas, it was a restful voyage and a precious time for Russell and me to be together. We prayed much about our future ministry, and constantly our thoughts during prayer and discussions turned to New Guinea. Arriving in Holland, we wrote Dr. R.A. Jaffrey concerning our desire to be appointed to New Guinea. A letter from Dr. Jaffrey crossed ours in the mail, asking if we would be willing to accept an appointment in New Guinea. We never questioned again God's leading us to New Guinea. We progressed well in our study of the Dutch language. I loved the country and its people. We made many friends and carried away wonderful memories. Traveling via London and Paris, we proceeded to Marseille to board the ship for the Indies. That's the end of the memory there. Back in the present, dawn was interjecting itself into the cell. Brushing tears away from my hands, I wiped them onto my arms, and I was determined, God helping me, that the Japanese would never see or hear me cry. Well, she is super tough because I have no problem letting people see me cry. I could be at the grocery store crying. Silly thing sometimes. I knew that I must rise and try to get my dress dry. Moving slowly back and forth, I waved my skirt in the air. I dared not remove my dress, as I had no slip, nor did I know when my cell door would open suddenly. Miraculously, my skirt was dry when I stood to receive my food. I could hear the guard coming. As I had eaten and my plate had been collected, I slumped against the wall. When I came into the Kampai Thai prison, I knew I had dysentery. Now the debilitating effect of dysentery was already draining my strength. I wished for a cover for the kerosene tin. More and more flies were coming in through the transom. I had contracted it during the outbreak in Camp Peely, but had kept going because of the work quotas. Since there was no cover for the kerosene tin, a squadron of large bluebottle flies were attracted by the dysentery. When my plate of plain rice was brought, the flies filed squatters' rights to it before the tin plate had stopped spinning across the floor, because it appeared that I was to be fed only once a day and the portions were small, less than a cupful. I decided not to share. I fought off those dirty flies. How I hated them, and hid the rice under my skirt. I was very fond of rice, and the fact that they gave me no fork or spoon didn't disturb me. I had learned to eat rice a la Indonesian with my fingers. Reaching in under my skirt, I rolled some rice into a ball, waited until the flies were otherwise occupied, then popped it into my mouth. It became a daily contest between us, but I was usually able to outwit them. Weary, I lay down and began to count the months since our marriage of just over 6 years had been terminated by sickness and cruelty. I willingly accepted the year and a half we were separated, both in the States and while Russell was in New Guinea establishing our mission base. But Lord, being robbed by the Japanese of the last year and a half of our marriage, that is very, very bitter, I sobbed. Please, Lord, take this bitterness from me. I have so much of good and so many I have so much of good and so many beautiful memories that nothing and no one can ever take them from me. A man of sorrows, the one acquainted with grief, enfolded me in his arms. As he poured in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, the anger and bitterness were released, and I slept. In the dark hours of the night, Russell came to me in a dream. We were aboard ship, sitting on deck. We talked as he held me close. Taking up a basket that was there beside him, he took out a jar of sun cream. This, dear, you must keep with you. Your skin is so sensitive to the sun. Now I must leave you. Rising, he committed me to the one who would never leave or forsake me, and he was gone. I never dreamed of him again. Wow. Of course, when the guard had the slop bucket emptied the following day, he knew I had dysentery. The treatment was a glass of Epsom salts. Oh, how I hated that nasty solution. Further, porridge was substituted for the rice I had been receiving. The gruel was dirty rice boiled in water and not flavored with salt, sugar, or milk. The next day I received it, I saw what appeared to be shredded coconut floating around the surface. Oh joy! I love fresh shredded coconut, I thought. Closer inspection caused my joy to be short-lived. Oh no, I'm very afraid. Those were not shreds of coconuts, they were worms. There was a sprinkling of small stones and chaff as well. Carefully pushing those choice ingredients up onto the side, I lifted the enamel soup plate and let the porridge drain between my hands into my mouth. Knowing that I could have been left without any food, I gratefully thanked the Lord, worms notwithstanding. The flies were maddening. I couldn't manage the porridge under my skirt as I had the rice. By the time I had the worms on the perimeter of the plate, the flies were there feeding on them. I needed both hands for funneling the porridge into my mouth, so I couldn't shoo them, but in but a day or two, I came to the wise decision that if the flies could eat the worms, so could I. I shooed flies with one hand and removed only the stones with the other. With a mighty flourish of my hands, I brushed my tormentors aside, and as quickly as possible devoured the porridge, worms, and whatever. Then I licked the plate and my hands clean in order not to miss anything. Nights on the coast are cool, with nothing but the cotton dress and the full circle skirt to cover me, and lacking a mosquito net, I was generally miserable for sleeping. Early in the first week, I passed the time killing mosquitoes. I was tortured by hordes of them at night. They clung to the wall, too full of my good red blood to do anything else. Whenever I made a kill, a splattered blood mark was left. One day, when the guard brought my rice, he suddenly noticed the splotches decorating the wall. I had had an unusually heavy kill that morning. Infuriated, he ordered me to remove every mark and to have it done before he returned. I swallowed my porridge, not even stopping to look for stones, then gave my plate and hands a lick and promised before setting to work. I ate first because when he returned, it would be for my plate. If I were to be beaten, it might be easier to take it on with a partially filled stomach. Fear is a great persuader. Laboriously and feverishly, I scraped away all the dried spots of blood. When he did return for my plate, the splotches were gone. So were my fingernails. I had worn them down to the quick. Having learned my lesson from that day on, I killed my small tormentors by crushing them between my hands. I became quite adept at it, and my new technique kept the blood off the wall. The guard brought in two planks nailed to cross beams to serve as my bed. The mosquitoes were especially bad the first night on my new bed. They even seemed to get beneath the bed to attack me. Whoever made the makeshift bed had left 1-inch gap between the planks, but uncomfortable though it was, I was grateful. The planks kept me up off the cold ceramic tiles at night. Noticing bites all over my body the next morning, I slid over to the boards to examine them. Just as I suspected, they were crawling with bed bugs. I dislodged the vermin from the grooves with a hairpin and then crushed them as they tried to make their escape across the floor. When I finished, I scraped together whatever was left of their bodies, threw them in my tin, then spit on the floor and rubbed it with my hand until all trace of my kill had disappeared. I was grateful for the ceramic tiled floor. I couldn't have killed the bed bugs on a clean floor with as much ease. Nor could I have kept a dirt floor clean. I was grateful for the ceramic tiled floor. I couldn't have killed the bed bugs on a dirt floor with as much ease. Okay. Nor could I have kept a dirt floor clean. How dirty my dress would have become sitting on a dirt floor. Also, the tile was refreshingly cool during the heat of the day. There was a space under the door through which I could blow to the outside the dust I had scraped together when all the killing and cleaning were finished. I spit-bathed my hands, and with a measure of finesse and rubbing and rolling the dirt off into the tin. I had learned a valuable lesson from my New Guinea friends. If I hadn't known to do this, my plate would have been compounded, for I never received soap or so much as a drop of water for washing. The days were spent in contemplation of the goodness and presence of my God, and in listening to the noises of the other prisoners. I listened to those who were allowed to go into the courtyard as they chatted in the sunshine. I listened to the sound of footsteps on the concrete walkway and learned to distinguish the padded sounds of the guards' tennis shoes from the hard clicks of the leather-bound boots of the officers. I listened to the guard coming to get others on death row. I listened to the torture as prisoners screamed, pleading for mercy. I fell to my knees, covered my ears with my hands against this horror, and cried out to God to undertake, in his great mercy, and spare their lives. I heard their limp bodies drop like wet sacks to the floor, the sound of silence that then meant that the prisoners were unconscious. I listened when prisoners were dragged along the walkway past my door, listened to the cell doors being opened and the victims dragged inside and left to regain consciousness in the solitude of their cells. I listened to their sobbing and moaning, signals of their returning to consciousness. According to the radio reports from countries that had been invaded before the Netherlands East Indies fell, we had learned that the Kampantai had many forms of torture used for extracting information. None held greater horror than the water treatment. The hapless one who was to receive the water treatment was pegged, spread eagle on the ground, face up. A rubber tube was forced down the prisoner's throat and into his stomach. Water was then poured through this tube into the stomach until it became horribly distended. The secret police then jumped on the bloated abdomen or rammed the stomach with a cane until the desired information was forthcoming or the victim fainted. Irreparable damage and internal hemorrhaging resulted from this form of torture. One of our young Dayak students was tortured at the Kampantai headquarters prison. He said he was forced to hold high above his head a 5-gallon tin of water, and while all the muscles were stretched taut, they rammed him in the stomach with their canes. He was completely innocent of any subversive activities, but by then the damage was done. He suffered intense pain, but he was one of those God could trust with pain. He could still praise his glorious Lord and forgive those who caused his death, for he died shortly thereafter of his internal injuries. If prisoners were not returned to their cells immediately, I had to will myself not to think about the water treatment. I could be the next victim, At such a time as this, I took refuge in God's Word, especially Psalm 27 and Psalm 91. The most malignant sound to my soul was the ranting of Miss Seeley. To hear her this way, realizing that she had probably been mistreated to force a confession about my alleged crimes, was a burden most unbearable. Day and night, she called out phrases in Indonesian. I think she was trying to sing, but because she was tone deaf, there was no melody. Just an awful, raucous sound coming from her cell. For more days I was left alone to absorb this cacophony of horrors, a part of the softening up process. The next day, the Japanese guard led me to the interrogation room for the first time. The two men whom I had met in Campili were waiting for me. The guard was the number 3 man of the examining team. I mentally labeled the tall, cruel man the brain, for he was the brains of the team. He formed the verbal bullets, and the interrogator fired them. The interrogator was small and slim, with a shock of curly black hair and a large, forceful hand. The brain didn't look Japanese. Not only his height, but his features were very different. His eyes were piercing black pools of pure, unadulterated hatred. The brain and the interrogator sat at tables, and I was placed on a chair between them. With pen and paper before him, the brain always positioned himself on my left, just out of my line of vision. He could then observe my every expression and response to their questions. The interrogator sat directly in front of me and within arm's reach. The brain never addressed me directly. His questions were fed into the interrogator in Japanese, who in turn fired them at me in Indonesian. My responses were in Indonesian. Because of this procedure, I assumed that the brain didn't know Indonesian. If an answer didn't please the brain, he would snap an order to the interrogator, who struck me a swift karate chop with the cutting edge of his hand. He was skilled in striking with great force and precision that very tender, close spot to the shoulder at the base of the neck. A well-placed blow was excruciatingly painful and paralyzing. Other times the interrogator used his middle finger. Flicking it from behind his thumb, he thumped me repeatedly between the eyes until I thought my nerves would explode. My forehead became bruised and swollen. Often I felt I couldn't endure to be touched again, but the Lord comforted and strengthened me. I remember Dr. Jaffrey's injunction, "Lassie, whatever you do, be a good soldier for Jesus Christ." I prayed that God would help me. The hearings for my first interrogation was only one of many, lasted an hour, 2 hours, sometimes longer. All the questions were relative to my alleged espionage activities. What contact had I with the American military personnel? What knowledge did I have of Morse code? Because they reverted to this question so often, I began to think that there was a radio somewhere that they were trying to find. Who were my superiors? Where had I been groomed to become a spy? Where did I get my radio? What did I do with it when I was moved to Campili? Who were my contacts? If I didn't have a radio, how was I getting information out of the camp? On and on they went, infinitely and with enormous repetition. I prayed constantly that the Lord would help me to answer carefully and briefly. They tried to brainwash me into thinking I had been used by the Americans to spy for them, and that the Americans had betrayed me to the Japanese. They would be lenient if I confessed, they said, but I knew that in war times spies were beheaded. It was a psychological pummeling that left me bloodied but unbound. I gritted my teeth and vowed, God helping me, that they would never break me. This experience was to be repeated every few days for the next month and a half. I never knew when to expect them to call me to the hearing room again. I never shed a tear before them during the hearings, But when the guard had returned me to my cell and the sound of his footsteps had vanished, when I was certain that no one could hear me, I wept buckets of tears. In desperation, I poured out my heart to the Lord. Oh, Lord, I just can't go through another one. I can't, Lord. I just can't. Please, no more, Lord. When there were no more tears to cry, I would hear him whisper, "But my child, my grace is sufficient for thee. Not was, nor shall be, but it is sufficient. Not was, nor shall be, but it is sufficient." But the eternal, ever-present, undiminished supply of God's glorious grace. Just 2 weeks before I was brought to this prison, the Lord had laid it on my heart to memorize a poem by Annie Johnson Flint. Now I knew why. After drying the tears from my face and mopping the tears from the floor with my skirt, I would sit up and sing. He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction, he added his mercy. To multiplied trials, he multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, and our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, the Father's full giving is only begun. His love has no limit, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. Strength came, and I knew I could go through another interrogation and another and another. Just looking, there's a whole lot more pages going for this chapter. I was physically weak and desperately frightened, but God gave me the courage to deport myself like a good soldier for the Lord before those cruel men. One day I glanced longingly at the transom above the door. If only I could get some fresh air. I pulled myself hand over hand up the bars of the window until I could lunge and catch the bars over the open transom. I managed to balance, one foot on the doorknob, one on the windowsill. Hanging from the transom bars and balanced thus precariously, I could look out on the open courtyard. Because of the roof overhang jutting out over the walkway in front of this block of cells, I could see out, but nobody could see me. The cooling breeze blowing off the ocean was refreshing, and the sight of something other than my four walls was exhilarating. I must do this again, I promised myself, but now I need to conserve my strength. The mosquitoes had their revenge. I fell ill with cerebral malaria, a type of malaria that is often fatal. I burned and chilled. When the chills came, I wrapped my arms in the skirt of my dress around me to still the violent shaking. It was almost a relief to be awash in the waves of the burning fever that followed. To the Epsom salts administered for the dysentery, the guard added a glass of water in which powdered quinine had been dissolved. Swallowing those wretched, bitter solutions was torture in itself. The rank taste of quinine curdled in my mouth all day long. I longed for a swallow or two of plain water, but that was denied me. I began to suffer from the debilitating symptoms of the beriberi, a deficiency disease caused by the lack of vitamin B1 in my diet. My legs were becoming badly swollen. The tissues were filled with fluid. Daily I checked them, pressing my thumb into my leg to feel for the shin bone. I counted to see how long before the deep indentation disappeared and the tissues filled with fluid again. It was laughable, the contrast between my large, shiny legs and the emaciated condition of the rest of my body. Scratches underneath the window ledge, hidden from the guard's eyes, helped me keep track of the passing days, and with each new one I could feel my strength waning due to the beriberi. Would I also suffer paralysis and anemia? When I arose in the morning, I would walk around my tiny cell one way until I got dizzy, then around in the opposite direction, in a determined effort to keep up my physical strength. Much time was passed repeating scripture. Starting with A, I would repeat a verse that began with that letter, then on through the rest of the alphabet. I discovered that most of the songs we had sung when I was a little girl were still hidden in my heart, though I hadn't consciously memorized many of them. As a child and young person, I had a driving compulsion to memorize the written word. In the cell, I was grateful now for those days in vacation Bible school when I had memorized many single verses and complete chapters and psalms, as well as whole books of the Bible. In the years that followed, I reviewed the scriptures often. The Lord fed me with the living bread that had been stored against the day when fresh supply was cut off by the loss of my Bible. He brought daily comfort and encouragement, yes, and joy to my heart through the knowledge of the Word. Paul, the apostle, wrote that it was through the comfort of the scriptures that he had hope and steadfastness of heart to believe God. I had never needed the scriptures more than in these months on death row, but since so much of his word was there in my heart, it was not the punishment the Kempeitai had anticipated when they took my Bible. Late one afternoon, on a day when I had not been interrogated, I heard laughter and animated conversation filtering in through the bars of the transom. I thought, hey, I wonder if that isn't the girl who was in the office the day I was brought from Camp Healy. She was kind enough to deliver the housecoat to Margaret. She sounds happy. Now who around here could make anyone happy? Curiosity impelled me off the floor. I felt delight that someone was happy and longed to witness it, even if I couldn't share it. I climbed to grab the bars and pulled myself into position. There, on the ledge, was a knife. By sheer effort of will, I hung on, my scalp crawling. Dear God, where did that come from? Who put it there? When could it have been? Could it have been? Who put it there? When? Could it have been while I was in the hearing room? I slid to the floor, thoughts of happy people completely blocked out. Who? When? Why? Were my captors expecting me to commit suicide? Then they wouldn't have to continue the interrogations, all those ridiculous trumped-up charges. Or was that knife put there as evidence that I was in contact with someone on the outside who had brought it to me, and I had hidden it there? I tried to remember all I heard and read of Kempeitai dealings with prisoners, and a score of other possibilities paraded down the halls of my mind to be considered and explored. I planned to attack the guard and attempt an escape. Oh, the possibilities were legion. As fascinating as this is, and as much as I want to know what's happening with this knife, we're going to stop there. Let's say our bedtime prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Guide me gently through the night and wake me with the morning light. Amen. Well, I hope I can't say that you're enjoying this story because it's not a story to enjoy, is it? But I do hope that you're enjoying our time together and that you sleep well. And I will see you again tomorrow.